Hamjambo. Asante. Thank you so much to Professor David Simon and the Mistra Urban Futures team, and Professor Agong, and the CLIP team and the CLIP trustees for your generous invitation to speak at this year's Mistra Urban Futures Annual Conference on realizing just cities, learning through comparison. I especially want to thank the hosts for welcoming us to your beautiful city, Kisumu. We can only imagine how much you have fought and worked behind the scenes to actually make this conference a possibility for all of us. Today I want to reflect on what realizing just cities might mean for African cities like Kisumu. But before I do that, I need to come clean and open up a little bit about the fact that I have an adopted home here in Kisumu. It's a place called Karateng, where friends of mine, their families and I, and a group of friends of ours have started a library for children in the area. And now that we have a representative from the Kisumu County, it would be nice for you to all visit our library there, which is providing children books and opportunities to read. In fact, my name when I come to Kisumu is Achieng. So I want to reflect on what realizing just cities might mean for African cities like Kisumu. And I will begin with an encounter that I had with a young Kenyan man in Johannesburg who asked me this question: "Where are you from, my sister? Where is your home?" It was May 2008, and I was volunteering at a police station in Johannesburg, where displaced people from the DRC, from Zimbabwe, Kenya, and Mozambique were seeking refuge. The questioner was Edward, a man in his mid-20s from Kenya, who had been displaced by xenophobic attacks that had swept through South Africa at the time, claiming 62 lives and destroying thousands of rands worth of property, including Edward's business there. Edward was very irritated with my response to his question. I told him that I was from Nairobi. "You don't come from Nairobi," he told me impatiently. "I mean, where is your real home?" I have had this conversation more often than I can remember, and I'm sure many of us here in the room have had it too. It matters not that Nairobi is the city of my birth, the place of my firsts, my first steps, my first school day, my first bicycle ride, my first kati game. It matters not that my adult firsts were in another city, Johannesburg. My first job, my first car, my first and hope only marriage. My firsts do not matter because neither Johannesburg nor Nairobi can be my home. And my response, Nairobi or Johannesburg, is often met with disbelief. It's dismissed like Edward dismissed me. It's met with sadness and at times a belligerence. The fact that I can claim to come from a city marks me as an African woman who has lost her way and who has turned her back on her real provenance, a rural home where my ancestors lay in rest. I bring up this personal anecdote because I want to reflect on what rights to the city might mean in a place where you live, but is not considered your home. What is the right to the city in an African context, where our very identity, our way of being, and sense of belonging is complicated by the multiple moral and economic orientations that we live within, where people's social recognition and belonging are often based elsewhere, where the city is seen as a station and not a destination, where the city is considered a morally corrupt place by many, but is the means by which they gain a better life for their investments elsewhere. What do rights mean in this city? And which ones do those who pass through it desire? It has been 50 years now since Henri Lefebvre's writing on the right to the city. Written in the wake of social unrest in Paris in 1968, Lefebvre saw the city as an oeuvre, a work that both shaped and was shaped by the forces of capitalist production and the sweat of labor. For Lefebvre, the right to the city was the right to reframe labor's relationship with capital through everyday modes of resistance. Lefebvre's rallying cry for the right to the city offered no juridical or practical pointers as to how urban rights might be realized. But the concept has nevertheless gained ground in cities across the globe, from Cairo to Cape Town, Beirut to Bombay. The right to the city has certainly redefined and even revolutionized global discourses on urbanization. Taking it from its universal beginnings, academics, activists, social movements, and policymakers across the world have somewhat adapted Lefebvre's call. Marxist geographer David Harvey argues that urban residents must have the democratic right to use and distribute the surplus value of the city, the surplus value in the city which they create. Others embed the right to the city in local struggles around access to housing, access to land, water, to decent work. Still others see the right to the city as a right for citizens to take decisions around the planning, budgeting, and design of the urban spaces in which they live. The right to the city is also sometimes animated through calls for urban citizenship and immigrants' rights to urban space. And we can see this across cities across the globe, in the US and the EU, as people struggle to think through what cities might mean for people coming in from elsewhere. No doubt the concept is broad, right? And has come to mean many things to many people, and has had far-reaching impact on 21st century debates on urbanization. So in October last year, world leaders convened in Quito to agree on the principles that would guide the global agenda for the next 20 years. One of the most controversial debates on the new urban agenda was the right to the city. This call divided governments across the political spectrum. Canada, the EU, the US, India, Japan, Russia found themselves on opposing sides to countries like Chile, El Salvador, Brazil, Ecuador, South Africa, and Uruguay. At the heart of this tension was what the right to the city meant and its legal standing in countries that would adopt it. Anglo-Saxon countries, for example, tend to see rights in very legal terms, with states carrying legal and financial responsibilities for realizing them. While other states, not of the Anglo-Saxon legal tradition, saw it as a more broad principle to strive for. The concern from those opposed was what resources they would have to commit to make cities just. There were also worries that campaigns for urban rights would negate or ignore rural ones. It took frantic diplomatic negotiations before the Quito Agreement managed to retain some of the ideas of the right to the city, albeit in what critics argue is a far watered-down vision of Lefebvre's original concept. The words looked something like this: we anchor our vision in the concept of cities for all, referring to the equal use and enjoyment of cities, towns, and villages, seeking to promote inclusivity and ensure that all inhabitants of present and future generations, without discrimination of any kind, are able to inhabit and produce just, safe, healthy, accessible, resilient, and sustainable cities. But let not the vagueness and almost near incomprehensibility of this language detract from the spirit of what Lefebvre managed to ignite 50 years on. We cannot underestimate the ways in which the call and cry for rights to the city has gained widespread currency in all corners of the world, and the ways in which it has captured the imagination of a diverse group of urban actors, from gay rights activists to pavement dwellers, homeless groups, and refugees, all seeking a place to be in the city. But while it has united movements and people across geographies, the right to the city fails to capture how people seek justice in urban centers in Africa. And I argue that there are two reasons for this. The first, from its very beginnings, the right to the city has been based on the idea of the city as a distinct geographic location, a neat crucible within which rights are claimed and contained. From Lefebvre to Harvey to contemporary social movements, that fight for urban socioeconomic rights, the right to the city is inextricably intertwined with its geophysical location. Secondly, the right to the city emerges out of a specific form based on urban industry and manufacturing. It is only just then for labor in these cities to have a share of the surpluses that they produce. But majority of Africa's cities have not grown out of an industrial base. Many are built on the extraction of mineral wealth and agricultural surpluses with the sweat and labor of people who live outside the city limits. Indeed, these ideas of justice in the city make presumptions about the origins of Africa's urban wealth and assume that once people arrive in cities, that they will want to invest and stay put. Realizing just cities can be empowering to Africa's urban residents, but I want to show that it can constrain their ability to achieve their dreams and aspirations if we conceptualize it in this very narrow way. I want to illustrate this using the story of Caleb. Caleb, the bookseller of Kibera. I met Caleb in 2012 while working in Kibera, one of Nairobi's oldest and most notorious slums. In the elections of 2007 and 2008, the settlement was transfigured by post-election violence. Many lives and millions of shillings worth of property were lost and destroyed as opposing political factions from the country's two major parties, each with strong ethnic bases, took to the streets in this part of Nairobi to protest the outcomes of the elections. Indeed, the post-election violence of 2007-2008 continues to cast a shadow over the recent elections in the ways that evoke fear, anger, and disquiet. As Caleb found out, in Kibera you cannot just be an urbanite. You are constructed as an ethnic subject, linked to a homeland, and in this case, linked to a particular political party. Caleb was 19 when he moved to the slum from his ancestral home, Bondo, not very far from here. His father was a carpenter, and his mother grew vegetables on their small holding and sold them in the town market. When his father died in 1992, the family lost a primary breadwinner, and Caleb had to drop out of school to help his mother take care of his younger siblings. That is how it came to be that in 1994, he moved to Kibera and shared a 3-by-3-meter room with his uncle. He found work cleaning offices in Nairobi's city center. His shift ended early, and at 3 in the afternoon, he would set up a makeshift rack on Kibera's rail tracks and sell mali-mali, knickknacks, cigarettes, matches, sweets, all to supplement the paltry wage he earned each month. I think 150 shillings. The knickknacks made him a little extra, but not enough for him to leave his cleaning job. After a short trip home for Christmas at the end of his first year in the big city, he brought back his old school books, hoping he could sell them. No one had any use for the books back home, he told me. It seemed a waste for them to sit there gathering dust. I had at least 50 textbooks to sell, he said. Much to his surprise, the textbooks sold very quickly. People would come past my rack and ask me, "Do you have this book? Do you have that book?" I got so many requests that I decided to focus on selling books. By 1996, he had moved into his own room in Kibera and was doing well enough to marry. He left his job as a cleaner and decided to go into business selling new books. He invested most of his savings on stocking up with textbooks and self-help manuals, which are very popular across Nairobi. His business did so well that by 2002, he was able to buy land and build his bookstore in Laini Saba, $350. He named the store Kinda, a Luo word for endeavor. Now, for you who haven't been to Kibera, this was no feat for Caleb. Laini Saba is Kibera's most valuable real estate. The shop owners here are referred to as the Watajiri wa Dubai, Dubai's wealthy class. Indeed, Laini Saba is Kibera's Dubai, where knockoff designer clothes, construction materials, black market DVDs, food, drinks, and every imaginable item are for sale. Apart from his business acumen, two reasons made it possible for Caleb to build the largest bookstore in Kibera. First, Kibera is affordable, and it fits his life trajectory to make money in the city, to educate his children, and invest in his rural home, Bondo. My expenses are small because I live in Kibera, Caleb told me. Yes, I can afford to live in a housing estate in Nairobi, but I would not be able to save and grow my business and build my rural home where I will retire. All the money I put into my investments and I put into my stock so that when people ask for a book from a shop, they never miss it. Second reason why Caleb was able to make his business thrive is because he could only afford to buy this piece of land, Kibera, because it has no title. Land in Kibera is owned by various government parastatals. And so even though the settlement has existed for more than 100 years, the over 100,000 people who live there occupy, hold, and transact land outside of the legal framework. While land holdings are socially recognized, if you walk through Kibera, everybody will tell you who owns what piece of land and who sold it to them. While the land holdings are socially recognized, they are legally precarious, and Kiberans are consciously aware that they can be evacuated at any time. They are willing to take the risk. And because big business and developers are not, Kibera provides a toehold to the city that thousands of people would otherwise not have. All was going well for Baba Pierce, as Caleb is known, until 2007, when his books were stolen and his store was razed to the ground by his neighbors, people who he had sold books to, whose children played with his, and who went to the same church. You see, Caleb's crime in Kibera, in the big city, was being Luo in a Kikuyu-dominated part of Kibera. Notwithstanding his move to the city, his identity, where he came from, remained constructed by his ethnic origins. Caleb has since rebuilt his store. He continues to live in Kibera, but he is a sojourner to the city, focusing his energy on investing his savings in his real home, Bondo, where he is not profiled as being the other, and where he has a sense of belonging. While Caleb's story may seem extreme, his translocal way of being in the city is not. Even those in the city not facing such overt threats of violence as Caleb did, face a level of economic insecurity and precarity that encourages them to hedge their bets, to spatially diversify their lives and their livelihoods. The structure of their material and moral economies means that people geographically and spatially diversify the way that they live. Take, for example, Zimbabwean Somalis, DRC, and Ugandan migrants living in South Africa, who see that city as a station, not a destination, as a place they move through en route to other parts of the world, perhaps Europe and the US if they're lucky, or where they imagine going back home with the money they have made from the city of gold. Caleb's story, like that of many urban dwellers, raises three questions around what rights to the city might mean for people in Africa's urban areas. As the notion of the right to the city is central to this conference, whose theme, again, is realizing just cities, learning through comparison, I hope that these questions can provoke debate and provide some room for reflecting on justice in cities like Kisumu, Cotonou, and Cape Town. The days ahead. First, I think we need to rethink the geographic scales of justice. Harvey and Lefebvre's reading of the city is rooted in Marxist understandings of labor capital and the belief the rights to the city belong to those who labor in it. But what if cities were built on the back of workers elsewhere? The growth of cities in Africa is largely not based on urban industry, but on surpluses generated elsewhere through agriculture, oil, and mining. The labor that makes these cities possible is not necessarily based. Moreover, cities rarely carry the welfare burden of sick and aging labor. That burden disproportionately falls on rural areas. The question then is, can we envision a right to the city that moves beyond its geographic boundary to incorporate the places outside of it that have made it possible? For an African city to be just, it cannot only be for those who live there, but for those who need to come to it from elsewhere. It must be open for all those who built and continue to build its wealth. Second, we need to shift the metrics of urban development, the ways we measure success, and to recognize how people actually use urban spaces. For a city to be accessible, for justice to be accessible, we need to understand how people keep a foothold in the city and what kinds of spaces make it possible for them to realize their aspirations. From a materialist or even policy perspective, the places where people like Caleb come to in the city are seen as failures. The failure of capital to equitably distribute surplus value, the failure of the state to regulate such distribution and invest resources in the habitats where poor people live. But places like Kibera work for the poor precisely because capital has not yet maximized its exchange value, and ordinary people like Caleb can maximize its use value. This is not to say that slum formal settlements are perfect. They are not, by no means. But it is to recognize, as Marie Hoeksemeyer and others' work has done, that these spaces work for the poor precisely because of their low entry costs and enable people to access opportunities they seek in the realization of their dreams. Pushing for justice along a metric of success that focuses on consumerism, quality of life, the provision of urban amenities, and land titles, can somehow, somewhat inadvertently, make these cities poor. And I've seen these through processes of regeneration, through processes of provision of low-cost housing in our cities, where the beneficiaries in the end up being people who are middle class. These kinds of interventions, while well-intentioned, sometimes push out the people for whom they are really meant. As Brian said, interventions for just cities that are restricted to formal aesthetic elements or a narrowly consumerist vision of the public realm may offer an ideological cover for the urbanisms of injustice, displacement, and exclusion. Thirdly, to look at how urban processes of democratic participation can actively exclude marginalized urban residents. Participatory planning has become an almost universal mechanism for realizing democratic local government. Despite its inclusive ethos and just orientation, participation can create incentives for excluding the interests of migrants coming to the city. Those participating in planning processes rarely ask municipalities to dedicate resources to future residents when they themselves face acute, immediate needs. That new arrivals are often unpopular outsiders, facing formal and informal obstacles to public planning mechanisms, only heightens the probability of their exclusion. But on the other hand, those that see the city as a temporary stop that enables the accumulation of wealth for a future somewhere else, back home, may see planning processes as meaningless or as oppressively binding them to peoples and places. If their goal is to move, participating in planning processes that demand commitments from both states and residents could become shackles that prevent them from investing elsewhere. Indeed, life in the city is often about minimizing proximate investments to such an extent that people may appear socially marginalized and alienated from their neighbors. But this represents a tactical agency, a quest for access to the city, but without the responsibility that this might entail. So if we're thinking about participation, about how we create inclusive cities, we need to incorporate some of these dynamics and understand how people live and how people imagine their lives in cities. Such conditions demand we rethink the ethical and practical basis of political representation, membership, and inclusion. For many residents, inclusion is not about ownership and belonging, but about usufruct rights, the ability to live in and extract from the city without being bound by it. So where do we go from here? I cannot pretend to have the answers, and indeed it would be arrogant of me to even try. What I offer today is a series of questions and provocations, ones that I hope will carry through conversations in the coming days. We need an epistemology of the commons. Rather than impose our metrics of success and justice on city dwellers, should we not be learning how people need and wish to live and facilitate their trajectories through the city? We need to read the city differently. We need to, I'm so sorry. We need to read the city differently as a non-teleological, multi-local, and trans-temporal space. Not all cities followed similar trajectories. Our African cities have not followed the trajectories of cities in the West, which were really built on the back of labor and industrialization. What does this mean? It means that we have to acknowledge and recognize what the lives of people like Caleb tell us about how our cities are growing and where people are seeking a life. We need to approach our cities with new eyes, with an open curiosity and a humility. And this requires a methodological openness, a courage to affirm what we see on the ground, to see people like Caleb not as, to see people as Caleb as producers of knowledge and not as people who make irrational decisions about how they live their lives. We need to ask ethical questions about who we are seeking justice for. Is it those who have made their way to the cities? Or those whose labor helps to build its wealth, who we know are still yet to come to them? To borrow from Brenner, how can our planning frameworks open up spaces for the appropriation, self-management, and transformation of urban lives from below, without, of course, undermining government and city plans for the city? How do we balance these forces? On a practical level, rescaling our understanding of justice requires that we consider the urban and urban planning across multiple scales. Most of the abstract philosophical ideas from the most abstract philosophical ideas on community, belonging, and representation, down to the minutiae of public management, budgetary allocations between jurisdictions, key performance indices, population projections, and so on. We will need to approach each city and areas connected to it in ways that recognize the economic, political, and social configurations at work. But failure to think about the city in this way, as a translocal space, is a failure to achieve justice and the right to the city. Failing to rethink at these scales will also mean failing to deliver the rights to the city to people like Caleb and the millions moving to Africa's urban centers. I suspect I have been a bit harsh on Lefebvre, but recognized the dangers of incomplete and a one-size-fits-all mode of action. Lefebvre argued that each society offers up its own peculiar space as an object for analysis and overall theoretical explication. How much can we really learn, for instance, he asked, confined as we are to Western conceptual tools about Asiatic modes of production, its space, its towns, or the relationship it embodies between town and country? While Lefebvre did not mention Africa in this quote, his point nevertheless applies equally here. And I hope in the rest of the deliberations in the 2 days of the conference, that we'll really think about what Africa brings to the table with a view to ensuring that we do justice to those who come to the city and live beyond. Thank you.